When Princess Catherine sat down alone in that quiet room, the whole world expected her to read from a carefully written script. But she looked at those polished words, the ones designed to say everything and nothing at all, and she did something the palace almost never does. She said no. She pushed the paper aside, took a deep breath, and spoke straight from her heart about her little boy, Prince Louis, and the frightening journey their family had been living through behind closed doors. And honestly, that decision changed everything. For months, the palace had been completely silent. Engagements were canceled, schedules shifted, and the youngest prince simply disappeared from public view. No explanations were given. People started wondering, asking questions, worrying about what was really happening inside those ancient walls. Prince William had argued for that silence from the very beginning. He believed it would protect Louis from the endless gossip, the cruel headlines, and the permanent spotlight that follows royal children from the moment they can wave at a crowd. Catherine understood that completely. As a mother, she wanted to wrap her son in bubble wrap and hide him from the world's judgment. But somewhere along the way, she started to realize that the silence was creating a whole different problem. Louis had begun to believe that his condition was being hidden because the family felt ashamed of him. That one heartbreaking detail changes everything about this story. So let's go back to the beginning and understand what really happened. Prince Louis had been recovering from complications related to a serious respiratory illness. At first, the family thought it was just an ordinary seasonal infection, the kind of thing kids get all the time. But it became clear pretty quickly that this was different. The tiredness wasn't going away. He was pushing away his breakfast without speaking. He pointed to his chest and told William he felt too tired to eat. And the real turning point, the moment Catherine later described as the point of no return, happened during a private rehearsal at Windsor Castle. This was supposed to be a gentle return for Louis, a practice run before a formal royal appearance where the family could prepare without crowds or cameras or pressure. And midway through the morning, Louis stopped. He reached for his mother's hand and whispered that he couldn't catch his breath. Catherine knelt beside him immediately, closed both hands around his, and felt how cold his fingers had become, despite the warmth of the room. William cleared everyone except the medical team out of the space. He personally arranged for George and Charlotte to be taken to another part of the residence because he refused to let either child witness their brother struggling. That moment changed everything inside that household. Now here's where the contradiction starts to emerge between what the family was projecting to the outside world and what was actually happening behind closed doors. William insisted that every engagement involving Louis be suspended immediately. He believed one missed ceremony mattered far less than allowing the boy's condition to worsen. And honestly, that's hard to argue with. But senior aides warned that repeated absences would attract questions. In royal terms, an engagement is an official duty or public appearance carried out on behalf of the monarchy. And when a prince just stops appearing at them, people notice. The advisors wanted a controlled explanation before speculation filled the silence. William refused. He would not allow his son's recovery to become a public narrative while the child was still frightened and uncertain. But here's the thing, the silence didn't just protect Louis. It started affecting the other children in ways the parents didn't fully realize at first. George, as the eldest sibling, believed calmness was expected of him. He was trying to become stronger for everyone. But one night he asked William whether a younger brother could become seriously ill without anyone outside the family knowing. That question wasn't about palace rules. He was asking whether silence meant danger. Charlotte, meanwhile, noticed every closed door and every lowered voice. She understood more than anyone had explained to her. She started leaving handwritten jokes beside Louis's bed because she realized that laughter, even briefly, brought back the brother she recognized. And when she overheard staff discussing the growing attention after the announcement, she found Catherine and asked whether strangers were now worried about her brother. Then she asked whether Louis would have to answer them all. These are not questions children should have to navigate alone. Catherine carried a different burden entirely. She was reassuring Charlotte that recovery sometimes moves slowly while hiding how little sleep she had managed herself. She was withholding her darkest fears to protect William, and he was doing the same to protect her. Their love remained firm, but exhaustion was turning kindness into guarded silence. And at the center of all of this was Louis, too young to understand royal protocol, but old enough to recognize fear in the faces around him. He had always been the child who filled quiet rooms with questions and laughter and sudden bursts of energy. His place as the youngest prince meant he carried fewer immediate royal expectations, but he remained deeply important to the family sense of normal life. That's why his sudden tiredness felt so frightening. The argument between Catherine and William came to a head after she wrote her own statement. She placed those handwritten pages before him when the children had gone to bed. The palace-approved draft sat beside them, polished and careful. For anyone who doesn't know, a palace-approved statement is wording cleared by royal advisors before public release, usually designed to protect privacy and avoid confusion. But to Catherine, those sentences felt empty. They described recovery without admitting fear. They mentioned progress without revealing what the family had endured. William read the opening line and immediately shook his head. He reminded her that one public message could be replayed, analyzed, and remembered long after their son had moved beyond the illness. He asked whether she was prepared to see their child's recovery discussed by people who had never met him. His voice rose, then stopped. The anger came from fear, and both of them knew it. Catherine didn't retreat. She told him Louis had begun to believe his condition was being hidden because the family felt ashamed. Then she pushed the official draft away and said the polished language contained no trace of the boy they had nearly watched lose confidence in himself. She pointed out that George and Charlotte had learned to lower their voices whenever Louis's health was mentioned. Their eldest son watched every closed door. Their daughter left jokes beside her brother's bed because she understood that laughter had become part of his recovery. Silence was no longer protecting only one child. It was shaping all three. And then she told William something that I think genuinely broke through his defenses. Louis had made a request of his own. He wanted to thank the medical professionals who had made him feel safe. He wanted George and Charlotte to know their help mattered. And most of all, he did not want people to think he had disappeared because he was not brave enough. William sat down. He covered his face for a moment and admitted that his decisions had been driven not only by privacy, but by his own terror of losing control. That's a pretty remarkable admission from a future king who has been trained his entire life to maintain composure. Together, they reached a boundary. Catherine could speak, but she would protect the medical details while acknowledging the seriousness of the journey. But there was still one final authority who could stop the message. And that brings us to King Charles. Charles received the draft after an evening briefing and dismissed the room before reading it. He read the pages twice. When he reached the line about a child mistaking privacy for shame, he removed his glasses and set them down. The words unsettled him because royal duty often teaches restraint before children understand its cost. Louis had been protected from scrutiny, but that same protection had begun to make him feel hidden. William arrived soon afterward, and Charles asked only one question. Did the statement truly serve Louis, or did it merely ease the fear carried by the adults around him? William defended Catherine's judgment, but admitted that once the recording appeared, the family could lose control of the story. Reporters would examine absences, question decisions, and search for details the family had deliberately withheld. Communications officials had prepared a safer version of the statement, but it removed Louis's request to thank the people who supported him. Charles rejected that version. A statement stripped of the child's own meaning, he decided would protect the institution while failing the person at its center. He gave his approval on one condition. Louis had to hear every word before the recording was released and understand exactly what the public would learn. Catherine read the final version to her son in private. Louis listened with unusual seriousness, then corrected one phrase. He did not want her to say he was merely doing better. He wanted everyone to know he was getting strong again. She changed the sentence immediately. Charles approved the revised wording with a handwritten note that said, "Truth delivered with restraint could protect the crown more honestly than silence." So the recording went out. Catherine spoke calmly, thanked those who had protected Louis, and confirmed that his strength was returning. The response was immediate and honestly pretty overwhelming. Phones began ringing, headlines appeared, messages flooded the palace, but the tone of the coverage shifted quickly. Broadcasters began constructing timelines from Louis's recent absences, placing older family appearances beside Catherine's new statement. One commentator paused footage taken before the illness and began examining the boy's expression. William reached for the remote and switched off the television, and he said his son's recovery would not become entertainment, but something else was happening outside the palace gates that I think captures what this announcement actually meant to people. Families began leaving handwritten blue stars outside Windsor Castle bearing the same words Louis had chosen, "Getting strong again." The stars multiplied along a public barrier. Each carried a message for Louis or for another child facing a difficult recovery. Windsor Castle, one of the monarchy's main royal residences, had seen celebrations and mourning and national uncertainty. Now its gates held something quieter, proof that one family's fear had reached thousands of others. A newspaper placed Catherine's calm expression across its front page beneath the words, "A mother's voice." A smaller line repeated Louis's phrase about becoming strong again. That headline mattered because it did not present him as weak or broken. It presented recovery as courage, and it placed a mother's honesty above palace spectacle. Some commentators still demanded answers. They questioned why the palace had remained silent and why earlier absences had not been explained. Officials responded firmly that a child's health was not public property. The family had shared enough to acknowledge the journey without surrendering every private detail. And when one phrase from the recording, the moment we feared recovery, had changed direction, triggered intense speculation, advisors recommended a second clarification before questions grew louder. Catherine refused, she said, explaining every frightening detail would violate the privacy they had fought to preserve. The real turning point, though, the one that actually matters, didn't happen in a briefing room or in front of a camera. It happened when William found Louis sitting quietly after the announcement. No longer surrounded by doctors or siblings or protective adults, William entered the family's private garden room and found his son waiting in silence. He ignored the chair beside him and sat on the floor instead, bringing himself level with the child. Then he asked one simple question. How did Louis feel now that people knew? Louis hesitated before answering. He said he had noticed his father stopped discussing royal events whenever he entered the room. A royal engagement had once sounded exciting to him. During his recovery, those conversations disappeared. The boy began to believe everyone thought he would never be strong enough to attend one again. William had removed every mention of duty to protect Louis from pressure, but that choice had made his son feel excluded from his own. That's the thing about silence. You can't always control what it communicates. Then Louis revealed something his father had never known. During the most difficult week, he had heard William crying outside his bedroom. The child had pretended to be asleep because he did not know how to comfort him. That confession broke the restraint the future king had carried for months. William pulled his son close and admitted that bravery did not mean never feeling afraid. It meant speaking even when fear made silence easier. Louis held on to him, then made the decision of his own. He wanted to return gradually, not through a grand ceremony, but at a small family engagement where George and Charlotte could remain beside him. Catherine entered only after the conversation had ended. She saw William's expression, looked at Louis, and understood that something fundamental had shifted. Together, the parents agreed there would be no statement, no staged appearance, and no pressure until their son personally felt ready. Louis made his first return at a small family gathering connected to a children's community project. There was no advanced publicity, no formal speech, and no demand that he performed for the public. A community project is an organized effort designed to support local families or children, and this one allowed him to re-enter royal life without the weight of a major ceremony. Louis paused before going inside. Charlotte took one of his hands, George took the other. Catherine did not urge him forward or hide his hesitation. She waited until her youngest son chose the moment himself. Then the three children crossed the threshold together. William watched them and finally understood that recovery did not mean rebuilding the image that existed before the illness. It meant creating a new sense of safety. He had once believed privacy was measured by how much the family withheld. Now he accepted that silence could protect a child physically while still leaving him emotionally alone. Catherine had learned the opposite lesson. Honesty could free Louis from shame, but it couldn't become an excuse to expose every medical detail. She had spoken through a personal recorded statement because that format allowed her to acknowledge the truth while preserving the boundaries her son still needed. Charles later admitted during a private family conversation that the monarchy had not been weakened by the disclosure. He believed it had gained strength by facing hardship without turning pain into spectacle. His words mattered because the crown has long relied on restraint. But this moment proved that dignity and emotional honesty could exist together. When Louis completed the gathering and returned to his parents, he didn't ask whether he would ever be allowed to attend again. He asked when he could come back. That question became the final victory. His recovery remained gradual but stable, and the family placed his health and confidence in childhood ahead of ceremonial expectations. Catherine received a photograph of the blue stars left outside Windsor and pressed her fingertips against one message written by another child. She quietly asked that the display be preserved for Louis. William read a letter from a father who had also struggled to explain illness to his children, and he realized their honesty had helped families far beyond Windsor. Louis chose one star to keep beside his bed. Its message was simple: you were brave even when you were resting. The monarchy answered with restraint. There would be no campaign, no celebratory photographs, and no rushed return. Catherine's decision had never been rebellion or publicity. It was a mother correcting the message created by fear and giving her son permission to see himself as recovering rather than fragile. The family had spent months believing love meant building walls around him. They emerged understanding that protection also required listening and honesty, and the courage to admit fear. The silence had served its purpose. Then compassion required it to end. Princess Catherine broke her silence so that Prince Louis would never mistake a private struggle for shame. And when Louis walked between George and Charlotte without being carried or hurried or shielded, the fear no longer controlled them. The difficult chapter was complete.